Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the 2 by 2. It is the podcast for independent consultants. If you haven't heard, spread the word. We are really lucky today. We're here with Ryan O'Toole. Ryan has had a multifaceted, really interesting career across management consulting, private equity, and senior advisor and operator. Ryan is a true hybrid of someone who has seen and solved and implemented the fixes across many different layers of business. So, Ryan, welcome.
Thank you very
Ryan's
much.
background, his background's with Vista, with BCG, with HG Capital, which he tells me is the Vista of Europe. Any other, you want to toss out your own company too?
Yeah, sure. So I'm doing independent advisory, JRO Ventures, and working with PE-backed firms, PE-backed companies around value creation and AI strategy.
Yeah, so super interesting. Okay, so here's why I asked Ryan to join us. Boards. For those of us who have not dealt with boards, particularly private equity or private company boards in their career, which is a lot of independent consultants who are coming from corporate or pure management consulting backgrounds. We don't tend to have it tends to be a bit of a black box, at least it has been for me. Ryan is an expert in this and has, as I said, sat on many sides of the table. And so I thought we'd have just a chat between two friends. And so Ryan's going to teach me how this works. And this is going to be a very free form conversation. Expect dumb questions from me, Ryan, and listeners, which I think is fine because it's going to help everybody else learn a bit today. So we did a prep session. And in the prep session, what I very quickly realized was there were actually different types of boards which have different objectives, types of members, etc. And let's start there, Ryan. Do you want to give us kind of the lay of the land of let's
Sure.
disaggregate boards into actual reality, please?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the one people are most familiar with are public company boards, right? Those are governed by the SEC. It's a lot around governance and risk management and compliance, typically higher level discussions. But then you get into private equity back boards, which I think probably a lot of us end up working with a lot of mid-market companies or on the bigger side of that. And it's kind of an interesting dynamic because you've got the deal team, you've got operating partners or operating advisors, you have probably some independents as well. And there can be different dynamics between majority and minority control, right? And sort of who's calling the shots. And so I've got a lot of experience on those. We can talk more about that as we go. And then you've got just sort of founder of private company boards. A lot of times those are more guidance and accountability. And then you have advisory boards. And a lot of times the advisory boards are the earlier stage companies, right, that are looking for, people, that are associated with them to help raise awareness, bring customers, bring things like that to them. So, boards are a bit different, and they can play different roles just kind of depending on what stage of the company and sort of where they are in their life cycle.
Generally, so let's put public company boards aside, but talking about private boards, generally what's the purpose of their meetings across the year? Like, why are they getting together and what are they trying to accomplish in those sessions? Like, what's the real, like the root of what they're trying to get done?
Yeah, I mean, if I think about a private equity backed board in its simplest terms, is are we on track to deliver on the thesis that we underwrote? Right. And, most of the hold periods are between 3 and 5 or 6 years. So you've got a finite amount of time. And, typically what I've seen is quarterly meetings with the full board and they want to know how are we doing, sort of what's next and are we on track? Right. And then sort of how can we help? And then there's often like a monthly financial review, right, where you'll go through the monthly financials and sometimes major strategic projects. Different private equity firms have different levels of involvement, right? I've been kind of on both ends of the spectrum. You've got some of the ones that are much more operationally involved and or single sector focus folks that really, really know the industry pretty deep. And so, I think the other things that people don't always think about, but they're also looking at like, how's the leadership team? Right? Do I have trust in them? Because they don't get that much direct interaction. That's one of the few times they get direct interaction with the leadership team. And so they're also looking at, do I have the right leaders in place? Do I have the right team in place to deliver on a thesis? And so it's kind of interesting. I think it's always a balance between level of detail and sort of taking a step back. And so we can talk more about that as we go to.
Yeah. Who are these people? Here's another question, right? Like, here's another question I get is, or I hear, and I don't have this desire. You can tell me if I should one day. I don't think so. People say, one day I want to be on a board It's like this seems like this strange aspirational goal to me. So, who are the people who sit on these boards?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, in private equity context, it's usually one or two people from the deal team. It's usually someone who's kind of a mid-level kind of principal, kind of depending on what the title is. Typically was in investment banking for a couple years, has been at the firm for 5 to 7 years. They're the ones that usually probably found the deal and really helped to drive and underwrite it. And so they're like, and I would say they're also like, how am I going to get to be partner in the firm, right? So they've got a lot of vested interests in their deals going well. Most of them don't
Okay.
have
So,
lots of deals. They usually would have 3 to 5 deals, right? And so they have a lot of vested interest in the financials and, oh my gosh, like I'm betting my partnership on this, right? And
yeah.
so,
Okay.
and then you've usually got like a senior deal person who's been around the block a lot. They do a lot of the rainmaking when it comes to, finding deals and working with investment bankers, et cetera. They're usually a clip or two above. You almost can think about it in our old consulting world, sort of an operating partner versus like the relationship partner, right? There's some of that. And then you'll often have an operating partner, right? And that could be someone who's part of the firm, who's usually been a seasoned CEO, CFO, something that has to do, with that company specifically. And it's kind of interesting because some firms use the same folks for multiple companies, and other times you might just have a person who's just on one company. So there's sometimes disconnect between the operating and the deal side, kind of just depending on how the structure is. And then some of them will have outside advisors. So like third party, more independent board members, usually that have something to do with the industry, right, that have been around or they can help bring connections, et cetera. So typically on a private equity board, you'll have anywhere between 4 and 6 board members, kind of just depending. There are some nuances of that where sometimes you'll have two firms that did the deal together. And so you might have double that sometimes. So you have to watch. And then sometimes you have prior investors that have rolled over. And so they're on the board now, but they take a much less active role because they only have a small portion of their capital left. They've kind of taken their money off the table, right? So you've got
Yeah.
like the board understanding what the board dynamic is of the company is kind of important, right? And also
Yeah.
what stage they're in, right? Because you think about like an early investment versus I'm getting ready to exit, they'll have different things that they're thinking about.
Yeah. Okay, let's come back to that in a second. Let's go back to this idea of incentives. So you
Yeah,
started with kind of the you said the word kind of the mid-level people,
yeah,
guys, I'm guessing like more than often than not they're guys. They have a they have a carry, right? So they have a
correct,
financial stake in addition to this career stake. But everybody
correct.
on the board generally has a financial stake in the deal at some point. But what I heard you say, which I think is important, is there's a nuance here, which is that is not equal across the board.
No,
And that level of importance for that particular board is probably not the same for every single person. Case in point,
right,
you're a senior advisor, long history, you got some financial stake in this game, but this is primarily upside for you. Like you're not
correct.
in this. Your primary goal here is not the money. You've got the senior partner or the operating partner, perhaps for them, like it is about the actual deal and the dollars. For
Yes,
the more junior people, you've got a mix of dollars and career. For that senior person, let's go back, or people, the advisors. Why are
yes.
they there?
From what mostly I've seen, a couple things. I think one is they want to stay active, right? So a lot of them have had a really good career, right? They kind of go into pseudo retirement where they want to kind of keep their brain working. They also want to stay fresh in the industry. And it really kind of helps them kind of have the career after the career, right? And so I think the other piece too is that they want to teach, right? They want to let others learn from their experience. And again, as we talk about sort of how to handle boards, that's something I think a lot of people miss, right? Is people think about I need to go present to the board versus wow, what experience and what is the collective experience this board has that can really help us, right, and inform us and look around the corner and have secondary and tertiary impacts of things that you can't see when you're looking at it outside in.
Yeah. So okay. So you've been in this situation many times. And let's just add in here, like as an operator, you've been on the board and you've been presenting to the board. So like you've
Yes,
had your own
yes,
incentive here too. As the person coming in, like how do you, like in your experience, how do you think about using each person's incentive? Okay, not just
yeah,
financial incentive with a capital I. Like, how do you think about using that in the service of what you're trying to accomplish? Like,
yeah. That's a
you
great question.
started, but go deep because I think I have a hypothesis here. So for
Mhm.
listeners, I've known Ryan for a long time. You are obviously your high IQ, you're super high EQ. So you clearly are doing, my guess is at least you're doing something different here than a lot of people would do. So
Yeah.
how are you thinking? Like, how's Ryan thinking about this when he goes into the room?
Yeah, so I'm thinking about the deal folks know the numbers inside and out. They also know the industry really well. They've also done a lot of the diligence. So they know the history, they know the why, right? And they have a big vested interest in the company doing well. Like I think sometimes people say, well, all they do is they care about the numbers. They don't have any operating background. And so it's a lot harder than they think. And, that could be true in some instances. But I think they know the deal and sort of the premise of the deal, market stats and things like that better than almost anybody else, right? Because they've spent hundreds of hours doing diligence and all these things, and they have a lot of context, right, around how things came through. And so I think with the deal folks, I always really like to think about how does this impact the numbers, right? How does this impact my exit value, right? What's the glide? The other thing that I used before is what's the glide path to exit? Right. You think about it, there's a 3 or 5 year window. Like, what do we need to look like at year 2, year 4, and like to be able to sell to whoever the next buyer is? And so I think really
Yeah.
understanding their view on the investment thesis and sort of how the numbers have to translate to that and like what the trade-offs are. They might say, hey, look, I'm okay trading off some EBITDA for growth, or I'm not because of where I am in the hold cycle. So they'll have a lot of expertise on that piece of it, right? The operating partner, operating advisor, they'll have a lot of pattern recognition in the space, right? So they'll usually like been a CEO, been a gray hair, right? Like they've been around, they're talking with the CEO often multiple times a week, right? Cell phone calls, et cetera. So they're usually well connected into what the CEO is thinking, sort of what kind of pattern recognition have I seen or have they seen across the portfolio, et cetera. And then your external folks, they got a lot of just industry knowledge and connections, right? So if you're like, man, I'm really thinking about like, how would I go approach Citibank for this type of software? Well, gosh, you have someone who was the former head of procurement at Citibank. Okay, great. Or you have someone that was like the head of a school district in Chicago was on one of the boards, right? We had someone who was a congressman that was on one of the boards, and they just have all these connections and sort of this knowledge usually of the customer, right? That you can draw on. And I think it's kind of interesting because most people do not think about talking to boards or members of the board between board meetings. They're like, okay, I got a board meeting. I'm going to write my deck. I'm going to sort of zone in and then I'm going to present it all out so we look brilliant. Board meetings should really also be to get the input, right? Like you have just such again, a wealth of knowledge from folks. And if you treat it as hey, we know what we're talking about. We've done the work and I have all this knowledge that can help me refine it and operationalize it and make it real, right? That's a really just different mindset to go into than I think historically, if you grew up in a consulting shop, that's a little bit different, right? Because you were doing the pages to then,
You do not go in and ask them what
no,
they think.
no, to give to the partner that then goes into the deck, that then goes into the other deck, that goes into the other deck, right? And like you're a lot removed. And it's interesting. I mean, I think it's one of the values of being a consultant and an advisor is you're not in the weeds all the time, right? So it's sometimes tough for an operator to take that step back and say, what does all this mean? Right? Because like they just got off the phone with Walmart, who's beating the heck out of them on a price, right? Or they just got,
Mhm.
and so I think also really being able to help our clients frame the story. One other thing I just thought about too, and again, we can figure out where how to pick this up is if you think about a board member, they don't have exposure to the last 2 months, right? They
Right.
often, right? Like they know what you told them last time, right? And so I'm also a big fan of like, what did we tell them last time? What did we commit to, right? Where are we against that? Where is it going well? Where is it not? And how do you take it up a click, right? To be able to say, how does impact the company, the thesis, the whole story, not just, hey, I did a sales comp project and here's why we're going to change it for, the North American sales force.
Yeah. Okay, let me put a bow on that. I'm hearing you say that being simple and working with a mind of synthesis, it's like simplicity and synthesis are emerging for me as two of the traits that you're saying. And what I mean by simplicity is like this to me feels like the basics. Know the people in the room,
Yeah.
understand why they're there, understand what they want to have that they don't have when they walked in or dialed in, and
Yeah.
then frame your conversation in a way that gets them there.
Yeah.
Um, and the synthesis of what you have and what you learn and what that means for them in a
Yeah.
really quick way is one of the keys to success.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things that, again, I learned borrowed from someone else is if you start your deck or you start by thinking, what would a great outcome of this meeting be?
Yeah.
Right? And a great outcome of this meeting is A, B, and C. And therefore, how do we get to that great outcome? And part of it's hard, right? Like everyone's cranking on, hey, it's a board slide, and like you spend so much time thinking about the deck and the analysis and what's going in there, you don't take a step back saying, like, what do I want to get out of this?
Yeah,
Right?
I always like, what do you want to walk? What do you want them to walk out of the room with? Like
Yeah,
that's always the first question. In any kind of senior meeting,
yeah,
I would go into that with that too.
yeah.
I have a question. I wanted to go back to this idea. Of I'm stuck on incentives, but there's competing ones. So if you
Yeah.
have the operators and the gray hairs that have a somewhat altruistic reason for being there, and
Hmm.
then you have, or altruistic or intellectual reason for being there, and
Yeah.
then you have the deal guys who, are more about, it sounds like they have a more financial and personal reason for being there. What kind of conflicts arise between those two forces? Then how do you, as the other person on the other side of that, are you moderating it? Are you letting it play out without you?
Yeah.
Are you instigating it to get more information? Like, how do
Yeah.
you handle being in the middle of that tornado?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think said like a true consultant, it can depend, right? It depends on how well they know each other, right? And so having general pattern recognition, but actually understanding the dynamics and observing first to see how it's playing out is also super important, right? You can see who people defer to, you can see, right? And so I think what will happen at times is folks that have been there before, seen it, done it, realize that it's not a linear path, right? Like very seldom is business linear, right? There's good months, there's bad months, there's, good wins, and so they are typically much more around, okay, what are the trends that I see? What are the underlying reasons? How do we fix them? It may take some time versus why is the churn in segment X, right? 2 points below what I underwrote, right? And so I also I also think it makes a ton of sense to meet with folks beforehand and have the relationship beforehand, as we talked about, kind of not just meeting in the board meetings, to make sure that everybody is on the same page, right? And when you get into the room, like one of the things I do look for is I do look for where there's conflict or where we've heard different things and you try to make sure that you bring that. 'Cause the worst thing to walk out of a board meeting is not knowing what the direction is, right? The
Yeah.
number one thing you want to have is like, okay, like where are we aligned? Where are we not aligned? And then what do we need to go do next? Right. And so
Yeah.
if you're hearing misalignment, I think it's really important to say, hey, like I may be hearing a couple different things or the good old line of just to make sure that we're clear, right? How do we think about this? And that's a hard position to be in sometimes, right? Because you don't have a say specifically, you don't have a governance role. But I think it's really important to help identify where you see those disconnects and to try to get the leadership team clear on what do we do walking out of this meeting and like sort of what does success look like between now and the next interaction.
Yeah. This might be a good, okay, let's do a little bit of tutorial here. Let's imagine our listener is about 10 years younger than us
Hmm.
and hasn't had the beat up cycles we've had in these senior rooms and maybe doesn't know these lines yet. You
Hmm.
just mentioned like there are things we say when shit starts to go crazy. You just
Yeah,
said one, I'll give you one, and let's see if we can come up with a good list.
sure.
Here's one of mine. What I'm hearing you say, Bob, is dot, dot, dot. And Sarah, what I'm hearing you say is dot, dot, dot.
Yep.
There's one for you.
Yep.
What are some others? Let's brainstorm.
Yeah, I mean, I think another one that I find is people often can get down different rabbit holes and things like that. So, hey, let's take a step back. What's the most critical thing to get right in go to market for 2026? Like, how do you bring people back up to the level of, not problem solving in the meeting, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah. There's a yeah, I've got one. Okay, so this concept of altitude, if
Yes.
people start to tangent a rabbit hole, it's like that is a great like 5,000-foot view. What we're talking about here is like we're at 10,000 feet. We all need to kind of come up to the same level, and then we can go down and figure out through
Yeah.
each of these paths.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah, I'm a
another
big
one.
fan of like make sure we're aligned at the top level and then we can get aligned
Yeah.
at the bottom, like, right? Like, so if we're not aligned up here, nothing else here matters, right? So,
Right. Oh
yeah,
my
and again, trying
god.
to take it back to like, what are the core business objectives, right? Like, Is it growth? Is it profitability? Is it, reference customers, right? What are the most important things right now for the business?
Yeah. Another tactic I use is to ask a question of a person who is not back and forth. So if this, I think, would especially work if you have the senior operator. You know,
Yeah.
Jim, have you seen this before? Or Jim, like, what's your opinion
Yes.
on the
Well,
the the topic? Right.
yeah,
Throw in another
really
voice.
pulling people in, pulling the right people in is also really important. I think the other thing to watch out for, and this is similar but a little bit different, we used to have what we called an and one rule, right? Which is if somebody on the leadership team um, said something, only one follow up, right? And one. You can't have like, oh yeah, and they keep going back and forth, right? And we started to do that actually on the private equity side too, is because otherwise the private equity firm can dominate the conversation. And so we said, okay, like after someone speaks, right, one more person can say something on that, on that team, and then we turn it back over. And I think that was actually really powerful and really helpful versus watching people just go back and forth in the meetings too.
When you did that, was that like a rules of engagement you established first, or was that like a side eye to your partner so you all knew how to wrangle the
Yeah, it was
conversation?
actually a rule. There was a CEO of one of my companies that did it. He told us like one time like, in one of the executive sessions, sort of how his rules of engagement were for the team. We're like, wow, that's brilliant. We really like that. We should do that too. And so, I
Awesome.
haven't seen it done everywhere, but I thought that was an interesting kind of simple rule.
Yeah, that's a
You
good
know,
one.
I also think inviting opinions, right? And so giving yourself pause and saying, okay, here's what we found. Does this make sense? Has people seen something different, right? From your experience, right? Will this work? And so I think inviting that in, because we talked about before about people wanting to give back, right? And, there's human nature, like you don't want to see other people go through pain, right? And therefore, how do you actually let people give you guidance and you take that guidance in a way that doesn't feel threatened? Because a lot of times when you get a question, your first thing is to feel threatened. And so, oh, that's interesting. I hadn't really thought about it quite that way. Let me incorporate that. Right. There's another great line that, when it's like,
Yeah.
uh oh, ah, what I was thinking.
Yeah. I'll just mention this one and then I want to go back to something else you said that had another question. And again, this is for the mid-career person, us 10 to 15 years ago. It's okay to say, and you know this, but like, it's okay to say, I don't know, I'm going to get back to you. I think that's not used enough. And I had established a rule for myself a long time ago where if I don't say, I don't know, let me get back to you at least 10% of the time, then it means that I've lost credibility because there's no way I really you can't understand 100% of an issue.
Yeah.
So, I think it's okay to say that. And so let me ask you, like in a board meeting, I assume it's okay, you can't, obviously you don't want to say it to the critical things or the important things. You should know those. Like that's kind of obvious, but like, is it okay to say that sometimes?
Yeah, absolutely. What a great question. Hadn't thought about that angle before. Let me
Yeah.
think about it a little bit more and get back to you. Or, okay, I hadn't thought about that angle before. With that, it may tweak it this way and that way, but I need to do a little bit more homework to go do it. I mean, we're all human, right? I mean, we all love to have all the answers, but you're better off to be honest versus trying to make it up, especially with someone who's a seasoned operator and can figure it out
Yeah.
really fast.
Yeah. Mind trick out there too. When I did that, often did it, and sometimes I would do it on purpose. I do it with people whom I know they need to feel from me that I value them or that they need
Yes.
to feel some sense of importance. And so I would purposefully say it so they felt flattered by the fact that they came up with such an astounding insight.
Yeah,
Like,
absolutely.
that's that is a helpful trick, and by the way, that's a really helpful trick if you're a 32-year-old woman dealing with, a board of much older, more seasoned people who may perceive you in a certain way. Like, I was never afraid to play that card
Yeah.
sporadically, very sporadically, where I knew enough about that person that I knew they wouldn't perceive me as an idiot. They would, you know,
Yeah.
mirror that in themselves, so,
Well, you just remind me of something else that, again, I borrowed from someone else. Is they used to think about how do I want this person or this group to feel in the
yes.
meeting and not meeting. And I had never thought about it that way. Right? And you say, wow, I want this person to feel empowered or heard or that I've got it, right? Or whatever that might be. And if you all of a sudden say, how do I want them to feel? And therefore, like, how do I want to present things? It actually really can change the lens on how you show up yourself. right? Because I think typically we want to show that we know our stuff, that we're buttoned up, that we can answer any single question there is. And by doing that, you actually don't invite interaction. You can come across as a know-it-all. You can come across as not really understanding the industry completely accidentally because you're trying to do a monologue to show that whatever you got paid was worth it.
Yeah. Yeah, and the feeling doesn't always have to like, let's just say this, like, I think I kinda thought about that. I mean, I never thought about it that clearly, but if I'm looking back on it now, it's like, I wasn't always looking for people to feel good, right? Like,
Sure.
sometimes I
Yeah.
was looking for someone to feel like they had an ego, or sometimes I was looking for not every feeling is on the happy and roses side,
Right.
but the feeling part is, to be heard or it's great, but
Yeah.
some people wanna
Well,
feel
I
like
want them to
they're
feel more
important.
accountable for something, right? Or
Yeah,
I want them to see that there's more than one way to do this, right?
yeah, yeah.
So I do think, you remind me of one other thing too. I don't 100% subscribe to this, but it was an interesting way for me to think about things was someone had once said people uh, change their mind in private, not in public. And so trying to convince somebody of something that's really different than what they were thinking in a public setting is really hard. And so if you have something that's controversial where you're looking for someone to change their mind, like you go do that one on one and you think, and it sounds really obvious, but we don't do that in meetings, right? Because we want to be like, this is the answer, this is the right answer. And
Yeah.
if someone is really, if they're close to you, it's okay, right? But if they're pretty far apart, then thinking about you're not going to change someone's mind in a public forum of 15 people.
Yeah, there's no way. There's no way that's happening. Okay, so, I don't know if this is a Jedi mind trick, but political trick.
Okay.
You're in a if you have you ever been in a situation where I'm going back to this idea of incentives, okay, and these
Yep.
competing incentives.
Yeah.
Has there, in your experience, ever been a place where you wanted to set up that conflict? And, like, can setting up that conflict benefit the discussion if done elegantly?
Yeah, and I think about it as more of like when you see disconnects, right? And
Okay.
so when you see a disconnect that the incentive is sort of going to slow the company down, create confusion, right? Like the biggest thing you want to walk out of those things with is clarity. Another line that I love is just when you go into a meeting with a great leader, like great leaders, you walk out with more clarity and less things to do. So if you walk out of that meeting with less clarity and more things to do, then it probably wasn't a successful meeting, right? And so I think trying to identify where there's clarity, I think about it more like that versus really misaligned incentives. The incentives, actually, in private equity incentives are pretty well aligned, right? And you might be right in terms of
Okay.
like, is it a rounding error or is it like life changing money? But it is to buy a company, make it better, right? And sell it for more than you bought it for, right? And so typically what you'll find in private equity firms, there is more alignment, not less, on those types of things. Now,
Okay.
when you've got
That's good to
independent
know.
board
Yeah.
members, yeah, when you've got independent board members, it can be a little bit all over the place, but yeah, that's one of the more, private equity is hard, right? I think, I hadn't really thought about this way until a couple of years ago, but you're trying to buy a business and make it worth 2 to 3 times the value that you bought it for in 5 years or less. That's a hard job. That's a really
Yeah.
hard job, right? And so making sure that you're clearly aligned, that you understand what the objectives are, understand what the time frame is, all those things like you can't afford to flail, right? You get behind the thesis, it gets really hard to catch up. So I think that's the other important to think about, like when you're working with these private equity backed firms.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I just read a book, I'll show it to you. I don't know if you've ever read this book. It's called Essentialism. I don't know. It's a
Mm,
couple years
I've
old.
heard.
It's great. You would like it. It's easy read. And my mom friends told me about this app called Libby, and it's a free audiobook from the Austin Public Library. So I read it, I listened to it, and then I
Great.
bought the book. But here's the point of the book. The point of the book is strategy is the work of deciding what to say no to, and you need to say no to almost everything.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that's what I'm hearing you say is the whole point is like you got to keep people like on the essential tasks that change the curve, and that is in and of itself extremely difficult. So
Yeah. Yeah.
great
Well,
book, you should check it out.
the term that we used to use for it is ruthless prioritization. And ruthless
Yes.
means that there's like lots of good options. So that means you have to take off the table some really cool, interesting stuff, right? And it can even be, hey, if you can only do one thing over the next quarter or next 6 months, what is it? Okay, you get one more.
Yeah.
What's the second one? Because what happens is we have like the old was it Rodney Dangerfield movie where he's getting tested by the professor and the professor says, I have one question in 27 parts, right? It's really it's easy for us to take like the three priorities and turn them into 35 priorities, right? Or 27 priorities underneath. And so I think that prioritization and forcing the prioritization and acknowledging like great idea, not for now, right? We can't work
Yeah.
on 10 things
Yeah.
because
All right.
it's
Let me,
so
I
much
want to,
easier. So I was gonna say it's so much easier as an advisor and a consultant to say, oh yeah, yeah, like we just need to hire 5 reps. We need to come up with a comp plan, and then we need to go like point them to these 10 accounts. That's a lot of work, right? It's a lot easier to
right.
send than to actually do it.
Right. And when they go to those 10 accounts, they have to know what they're going to say and why those points matter to those people. And like it,
Right?
you start to unravel it, and the questions the list of questions becomes rather long.
Yes.
All right. I want to switch us to prep.
Okay.
Let's, again, like in the service of people who are stepping into their first few sessions with the board. What are your best practices in preparation? And like, what does preparation look like for you? Maybe actually, let me start a little higher level. When you think about the work that goes into the board meeting, 100 pennies, how many pennies are prep and how many pennies are the meeting?
I never thought about it that way. I would say I am probably, if you think about prep as after the slides are done, right? So I think about like, so if you say creating all the slides and then it's probably 75, 80%, prep, right, to get it right. I would say just in terms of like talking points and that kind of stuff, I think it depends a little bit on how controversial things are going to be, right? The more different views you have, the more you have to think about it. But I think it's prep not only for the individual. So back to your 100 pennies question. There's a lot in the prep because simple, good, complex, bad, right? And if you haven't prepped, you make things too complicated. And so I think figuring out how to simplify is super important. But not only practicing like your own things, but what's the dance that you're going to do with the other people in the room that are also presenting?
Mm-hmm.
Right. So I'm a huge fan of dry runs and writing down specific things to make sure you know what people are saying before you and make sure that people are saying after you. Most people don't do that. And I've done it both ways where you go into a board meeting where like everyone has their own thing and then everyone's kind of talking a little bit past each other or as they said before. And so like I think it's really important to also dry run it with the other folks that are going to be presenting and understanding how you dovetail in to the overall story.
Yeah, that's a great tip. I'll be honest, like that's something I always forget to do, except for the times that you do it. And every time you do it, it was worth it. Every single
Yep.
time. Because you
Yep.
do realize it's like you realize the repetitiveness, you repeat, you know the points to lay out for people. Like yeah, that's a great tip.
And I think, for me, and it sounds obvious, but I'm gonna say it anyway. What's the story you want to tell? And then how
Yes.
does the facts fit into that, right? And that was for me a big one. I was an engineer by schooling, right? So I was a bottoms up, like do all the stuff and then like, poof, what does it tell you, right? But like if you start to think about like what's the story I want to tell, you're so much more crisp, right? You're so much easier to flow. And I don't even when I think about it, like on a deck, I don't even open PowerPoint yet, right? My first thing is like in a Word document or in an email, like what's the story I want to tell? And then I think about that and I refine it, right? And now I use some chat GPT things, right? Like to help me think through like what are the different ways of presenting it. And I think starting there and really think about like what does the board like what does great look like coming out of this meeting? Where is the board today and like what do they want out? And then what's the story that's going to help them realize? If you start doing it that way, it just makes it so much easier. And it's interesting, even when I have like seasoned CEOs, COOs, et cetera, one of the values that we can bring is taking that step back and saying, what do you really want the board to do and know? And do the slide like
Hmm.
usually there's like 75 financial slides and then like 3 slides on what we're going to do. And so
Hmm.
it's like, and I think keeping the story short and using the appendix, right? And I'm a big fan of, by the way, the appendix is a separate document, right? When I open a deck and I see 112 pages, I'm like, uh-oh. Right? So like, how do I get to the 15, 20-page story? And then I can have the other stuff as backup. That's fine.
That's another good tip, which I don't regularly. I don't have to do decks with log appendices anymore. It's just not
Yeah.
the nature of our work. But I think that is if you have more than well, how do you okay, I was gonna say 10, but what number of appendix slides constitutes the need for a new deck?
Oh, depends on the time, et cetera. I'm not a big a fan of even if you got a long meeting, anything more than 50 slides max, right? Like, and that's like a
Yeah.
4 hour board meeting,
That's
right?
a 4 hour. Yeah.
Yeah, that's like a 4 hour meeting, right? And so I think kind of scaling it down from there could be because part of this too is we talked about this earlier, is you want dialogue. So where are you going to stop and pause and ask for reactions and get people's input, et cetera? And it's funny because we always think like, okay, it's be about a minute a slide. Therefore, if I have an hour meeting, I need 60 slides. And you can do an hour meeting with one slide. Yeah. And so I think that is also important. It's interesting because I do think we take for granted sometimes as consultants and advisors that we have gotten good at storytelling. We have gotten good at sort of taking that step back. And that's a lot of value that we can add, even if it's not on something that we worked on. So like I had a CEO that I used to work with, and he was new into the portfolio. They'd taken over a company that was there. We used to spend time just what's the story? And he just wanted a thought partner, right? And I
Hmm.
got a client now that's that way. Like, what's the story you want to tell? Like, let's just chat for a couple minutes. What are you trying to show? And like, let me help you think through that and give you a couple bullets. And by the way, like they'll usually take anywhere between 20 and 60% of what you say, but it makes it makes them feel meaningfully better. I mean, a CEO is a lonely job, right? It's a hard job.
Yeah.
And so like if they can have someone who's independent that doesn't have anything really out for them to help them think through the story, like that's a great value add, even if it's not specific to your project. Just say, hey, like,
Yeah.
you can even say, hey, here's where my stuff's fitting. How do you think about the overall story flow? Oh, well, here's how I was thinking about. Oh, that's great. Or man, it would be pretty neat if we tied this into that. It's just a helpful, it's a helpful thing that we can bring, right? As folks that have to be good at storytelling over time, right? To be able to do our jobs well.
Yeah. I'll tell you in my last 6 years of consulting work, that was 95% of my job. That's it.
Yeah.
Like, talking to 2 people who didn't have really a sounding board that wasn't going to be biased or political, and thought partnering, and then coming up with the storyline. And sometimes
Yeah.
he'd send me, 1,500 words of thoughts on a Sunday morning to digest first. And like, what a fun job to like go through that and then talk to somebody and
Yeah.
figure that out.
Yeah.
Okay, let me go through your points. Ryan's this is my first question and then I blew it up with 100 pennies. What are your steps to prep? Let's just
Yep.
go
And so this
through like
is
what's the process?
like this is assuming that I've already got the slides or the analysis done, right? And now I'm kind of between
Yeah, yeah, let's
sent the
assume
pre-readout and the board meeting. Yeah.
yeah, like well, we'll start here. You've pulled out a blank Word document. You're
Yep.
thinking about what they want to get out of it. You write the 10-point narrative, then
Yeah.
you build a deck, right? And the deck is back and forth with the people. We get it.
Yep.
What then are the steps that you're taking before the meeting starts?
Yeah. The biggest thing I'm thinking, look, I start with how do I want them to feel? Because that's going to be like the language that I use. What does great look like out of me? And I write those down again, right? And then I'm like, therefore, if that's the case, then how do when I think about my talking points, I think about a couple things. I think one is what is the one takeaway from each, like what's my storyline, but then what's the one takeaway, right? If I need to be able to clear a slide in 30 seconds, right? And so how do I clear that? Like if there's nothing else you took away other than this, what is it? Wow, you're really underpenetrated in this segment. It's a great opportunity for you. Shut up, right? Stop talking and pause, right? I do also do that too. Is I actually try to think about where I want to pause for impact or for input. I think is also really important. And then
Do
I
you
think
write the
about,
questions down? Sorry, do
yeah,
you
I
actually
typically
write questions down?
I typically do, yeah. I like to get stuff down out of my head because my head will kind of keep moving, and so for me to get something down on paper is just much more helpful. I keep it short though. Like I'm a bullet point person, so it's like all I think about is sort of what the reminders are. This is actually, as you talk about the prep, this is one of the other things that I like for me anyway. It's worked really well. Is if I try to think of exactly the words I'm going to use, I fumble. If I think about what are the 2 or 3 points that I want to make, no
Yeah.
problem at all, right? Because your brain's trying to think of like what's the exact rehearsal. So I always kind of write down like what are the key points, and I purposely do not try to wordsmith it, right? Because then I'll get mad at myself, right, for not using those exact words. And then I think about the different potential dynamics in the room, right? And what could happen and where I might get questions from and kind of who's thinking what. And the good news is if you're prepped for that, you can also often get to it before it even happens, right? You say, hey, I know this may look like we are over investing here. However, da da da, right? Like you can also often preempt like worries, questions, things like that, and you can diffuse stuff before you even get in, right? And so I think those are some of the things that I do. And then I think the other biggest thing, like getting closer, is just relax, right? Like take a breath, right? Realize that you're not going to know everything, right? Realize that there's probably going to be some typo in the deck that you missed, right? And don't let yourself get flustered by it, right?
If you're me, there's 4. Like, the queen of typos. I'm sorry,
Yeah.
I just, I skip
But it's so
words.
easy to,
There's
yeah.
yeah.
Well, and I think people are looking to us to be advisors, to be listeners, to help them with their issues. And so speaking slowly, right, listening more, right? Like my best presentations are when I have like half the words that I thought I was going to use because there's been such great dialogue, right? And so
Yeah.
like I'm a huge fan of dialogue over monologue and sort of how can I create dialogue where I get people engaged, where I get ideas going across, where I get to really pressure test this, right? Is something that I've just found really valuable. And I think over time I've gotten, I won't say I'm great at it, but over time I've gotten a lot better versus when I was earlier in my career in advisory. I'll say, for independence, I'd say the pressure sometimes feels higher, right? Because this is your this is your income. This is how you're making your living now, right? And but I think the more natural you can be and the more of a human being you can be, right? People see you as human. Now, you have to have superhuman analytical skills and communication, like all those types of things. But I think, it's really around trust, right? Do they trust what you're saying, right? And if you've been around for a long time, you've probably earned that. And if you haven't, right, a lot of the way you get trust is by listening and shared experiences.
Yeah. Looking ahead, is board membership on the retirement job list for Ryan O'Toole?
That's funny. You didn't prep me for this one.
No, I didn't. Because I know you think about retirement jobs. I got that. You told me that concept. And I can't let it go. Now I think about retirement jobs all the
Yeah.
time.
Uh, I think yes, in some ways, but otherwise being an advisor is also helpful because sometimes as a board member, you can't interact the same way as you would with a client. Like I love sort of rolling my sleeves up, solving issues. So I would say yes, but pretty surgically, right? To be like where I can actually help I actually have a conversation coming up about a potential board where I've got pretty direct experience and come at it from a little bit different way and something that I'm passionate about. And so, yes, I think so, but it's going to be pretty surgical, right? And it's like I'm gonna have to blend that with just sort of just overall advisory work to be able to sit next to somebody and really help them through because it is a different dynamic, right? When you're on the board, right, all of a sudden people are more nervous about what can I tell you,
Mm,
what can I not tell you, et cetera. And I actually think the position of being between the board and the senior operator is also a fun place to be.
great. Well, we'll end it there. Ryan O'Toole, they can find you. We'll link your information and they can find you on LinkedIn. But thanks so much for sharing your deep expertise and so many great strategies and tactics with the listeners today. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Of course, thank you very much. It was great to be on.
Okay, cool. Let me stop us. Great. Thank you so much.